No one ever paid attention to the little girl walking down Willow Street just after sunrise. The neighborhood was still half asleep, curtains drawn, coffee brewing behind closed doors. Yet every morning, without fail, Amina stepped carefully along the cracked sidewalk, holding a small plate in both hands as if it were something fragile and precious. A neatly folded napkin covered the food, trapping the warmth inside. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because she didn't want to spill even a single crumb. Amina was only 11, but her eyes carried a quiet seriousness beyond her years. Her sneakers were worn thin at the heels, her backpack slung loosely over one shoulder, already packed for school. Most kids her age rushed through mornings, complaining about being late or skipping breakfast altogether. Amina was different. She always woke up earlier than she needed to, moving softly through the house so she wouldn't wake her mother. She cooked the eggs herself, just the way Mr. Samuel liked them, not too runny, not too dry. At the end of the street stood a small, weather-beaten house that looked forgotten by time. Its paint was peeling, and the front steps sagged slightly under their own weight. This was where Amina stopped every morning. She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on the plate, and knocked gently on the door. 3 soft taps, always the same. She never rushed him. She knew his legs were weak, that each step took effort. While she waited, she studied the door, its surface scratched and faded, wondering what stories lived behind it. Sometimes she imagined the house as it once was, full of laughter, maybe children running through the hallway. But now, there was only silence. When the door finally creaked open, Amina's face lit up with a smile so natural it seemed effortless. "Good morning, Mr. Samuel," she said every time, like it was the first morning they had ever shared. She never asked for anything in return. No money, no praise, not even a thank you. To her, this wasn't charity, it was simply what needed to be done. She had noticed him weeks ago, sitting alone on his porch, staring down the street as if waiting for someone who never came. Something about that look stayed with her. The next morning, she brought breakfast. And the next, and the next. As she stood there, holding out the warm plate, Amina had no idea that this small, quiet routine, this simple act of kindness that no one else saw, was the beginning of a story far bigger than either of them could imagine. Mr. Samuel's house always felt colder than the morning air outside, yet Amina never mentioned it. Once she stepped in, the scent of old wood and fading memories wrapped around her. The furniture was sparse and worn, each piece looking as though it had survived far more years than it should have. A single armchair sat near the window, positioned carefully to catch the morning light, as if the sun were the only regular visitor left in the house. Mr. Samuel moved slowly, every step deliberate. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the plate Amina offered, and she instinctively steadied it for him, her small fingers brushing his. He always murmured a soft, "Thank you," his voice rough with age and disuse. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. To him, those words felt insufficient for what her presence truly meant. Amina usually pulled out the chair across from him, even though he never asked her to stay. She knew he liked the company. She swung her legs gently as she sat, her backpack resting at her feet. "We had a math test yesterday," she would say casually, as if talking to an old friend. "I think I did okay, except for the last question." Her voice filled the quiet spaces of the room, chasing away the loneliness that lingered in every corner. Mr. Samuel listened more than he spoke. His eyes followed her animated expressions, the way her hands moved when she talked, the spark of life she brought with her. Sometimes he nodded, sometimes he smiled faintly, and sometimes he simply closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words wash over him. For him, it wasn't about the stories, it was about being remembered. What Amina didn't know was that silence had once been his constant companion. Days blended into nights, meals into memories. He had lived long enough to see the world move on without him, and somewhere along the way, he had begun to believe he no longer mattered. But each morning, when Amina knocked on his door, that belief cracked just a little more. He never told her about the letters that stopped coming, or the friends whose voices he could only hear in dreams. He never spoke of the weight in his chest that wasn't physical, or how close he had come to giving up on mornings altogether. Instead, he simply ate his breakfast slowly, savoring not just the food, but the fact that someone cared whether he did. To Amina, these visits were just part of her day. She didn't realize that by sitting there, sharing her ordinary thoughts, she was doing something extraordinary. Two lonely souls, one young, one old, had found comfort in each other without ever naming it. And in that quiet room, over a simple breakfast, both of their lives began to change in ways neither yet understood. That morning felt wrong before Amina even reached the end of the street. The sky was heavier than usual, clouds pressing low as if they, too, were uncertain. She walked with the same careful steps, the plate balanced in her hands, the eggs still warm beneath the folded napkin. Yet something in her chest tightened with every step closer to Mr. Samuel's house. She knocked. 3 soft taps, just like always. Nothing. Amina waited, listening for the familiar shuffle of slow footsteps, the faint cough, the creak of the door. Seconds stretched into a full minute. She knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Her heart began to race, a quiet panic creeping in where calm usually lived. Mr. Samuel, she called gently, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence answered her. She glanced at the windows. The curtains were still drawn, the porch empty. He was never this late. Not once since she had started coming. Amina shifted the plate to one hand and tried the doorknob. Locked, cold, unmoving. The world around her felt suddenly too big, too quiet. For a moment, she considered leaving. School would start soon. That would have been the easier choice. But something deeper, something she didn't have words for yet, refused to let her walk away. She ran to the neighboring house and knocked urgently. A middle-aged man answered, confusion written across his face as Amina explained in rushed words that Mr. Samuel hadn't opened his door. The man frowned, then followed her back down the porch steps. After a few louder knocks and a call through the door, he made the decision Amina had been afraid of. He dialed for help. The sirens arrived too quickly and not fast enough all at once. Amina stood frozen on the sidewalk, the plate now cold in her hands. She watched strangers move with practiced urgency, their voices calm, their faces serious. When they finally carried Mr. Samuel out on a stretcher, she barely recognized him. He looked smaller somehow, swallowed by the white sheets and machines. She wanted to say something, to apologize for being late, to tell him she'd be back tomorrow, but the words stuck in her throat. The ambulance doors closed with a final, hollow sound. That afternoon, Amina returned home without going to school. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched breakfast she had brought back. The napkin was still folded neatly, just as she had placed it hours earlier. For the first time, she wondered if she had waited too long to care. That night, she lay awake listening to the house settle, her mind filled with questions she couldn't answer. Was he alone? Did he know she tried? Would he come back? Amina didn't know it yet, but that closed door marked the end of something familiar, and the beginning of a truth that would soon change everything she believed about kindness, connection, and how deeply one small heart could matter. 3 days passed with no news, and each one felt heavier than the last. Amina went through the motions of school, answered questions when called on, and nodded when friends spoke to her, but her mind was always somewhere else. Every morning, she still woke up early, out of habit, her body remembering what her heart refused to accept. The plate stayed empty now, resting quietly in the cupboard like a promise she didn't know how to keep. On the 4th morning, a sharp knock echoed through the small apartment. It wasn't the gentle, familiar sound Amina was used to making. It was firm, official, and unexpected. Her mother paused mid-step, confusion flickering across her face. Visitors were rare, especially this early. When she opened the door, 2 uniformed military officers stood in the hallway, their posture straight, their expressions unreadable. Amina felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach tightened as fear rushed in uninvited. She clutched the edge of the table, her mind racing through every possible mistake she might have made. "Is Amina here?" one of the officers asked calmly. Her mother's hand found Amina's shoulder instinctively, protective and tense. Amina stepped forward, her voice barely steady as she answered, "Yes, sir." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She had never spoken to anyone like this before. Uniforms meant rules, authority, trouble. She wondered if she wasn't supposed to go to Mr. Samuel's house. If she had broken some rule she didn't know existed. Instead of raising his voice, the officer softened his tone. "We're not here because you're in trouble," he said. "We're here because of what you did." Those words only deepened her confusion. They were invited inside, and the small living room suddenly felt even smaller. The officers remained standing, hats tucked neatly under their arms. One of them looked at Amina with something she didn't expect: respect. "Mr. Samuel is in the hospital," the officer continued. "He asked us to find you." Amina's heart skipped. Is he okay?" "He will be," the officer replied. "But there's something you should know." They explained that Mr. Samuel was not just an elderly man living alone. He had once been a decorated war veteran, a man who had served his country with courage and sacrifice. Over time, as years passed and people faded from his life, he had been quietly forgotten, until Amina. "Your visits," the officer said gently, "your breakfasts, your conversations, they mattered more than you can imagine." Amina felt tears rise to her eyes, not from pride, but from realization. What she had thought was small and ordinary had reached further than she ever dreamed. That knock at the door hadn't come to accuse or frighten her. It had come to reveal a truth. Even the quietest acts of kindness can echo louder than we ever expect. The room felt unusually still after the officers finished speaking, as if the air itself needed time to absorb their words. Amina stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. A decorated war veteran. The words echoed in her mind, heavy and unreal. She tried to connect that image, strong, brave, honored, with the fragile old man who struggled to open his door every morning and smiled softly over a simple plate of eggs. One of the officers reached into his coat and carefully pulled out a worn leather folder. He opened it slowly, revealing photographs whose edges had softened with age. Amina leaned forward, her breath catching. In the pictures was Mr. Samuel, but not as she knew him. He stood tall in uniform, eyes sharp, shoulders squared. In another photo, he laughed with fellow soldiers, arms slung around their shoulders, alive with a confidence she had never imagined. "He never talked much about his service," the officer said quietly. "But he talked about you." Amina's throat tightened. "About me?" The officer nodded. "He told the doctors and nurses that if it weren't for a little girl who brought him breakfast every morning, he wouldn't have fought to stay alive. He said you reminded him that the world hadn't forgotten him." Tears spilled freely now, sliding down Amina's cheeks. She had never intended to save anyone. She just didn't want him to be hungry. She didn't want him to be alone. Yet somehow, that had been enough. The officers explained that when Mr. Samuel was found, his condition was serious, not just physically, but emotionally. Years of isolation had taken their toll. But when asked who should be contacted, he had spoken her name with certainty. Not a relative, not an old friend, her. "He called you his reason," one officer added softly. Amina covered her mouth, a quiet sob escaping her. Her mother pulled her close, holding her tightly, her own eyes filled with tears. In that moment, Amina understood something profound. Kindness didn't need permission, and it didn't need to be big to be powerful. The officers stood straighter then, their voices filled with respect. "We've seen bravery in many forms," one of them said. "And what you did, that takes courage too." As they prepared to leave, one final truth remained hanging in the air: Mr. Samuel was not forgotten anymore. Because of Amina, his story mattered again. His life mattered again. And as the door closed behind the officers, Amina realized that a single act of compassion, repeated quietly and without expectation, had changed not just one life, but two.